So when we talk about natural law, when I'm talking about natural law, when I think the tradition's talking, it's talking about the facts of nature side, things that are evident to all men everywhere, not necessarily facts of creation, which you need a Bible to know. Right. So I think that, and I think that what you look to natural revelation to do, or what it's capable of doing in principle, is a key dividing line. So I think that there's a lot of stuff that's clearly, this is the Romans 1 text, it's clearly revealed. Things about God, things about us, things about the world that are clearly revealed. Now, Dr. Boot is going to come back and say, yeah, but we're sinners and we suppress the truth. And I want to say yes and amen. That's absolutely right. We do. But it's a truth suppression, which means the truth is there and evident and obvious and pressing. And sometimes, by God's gracious superintendence, certain even non-Christians can sort of recognize it. So I think this is how we account for the some of the accuracy, at least, of Aristotle and Plato and some of the philosophers, is in that case, the pressing of the light of nature, God graciously allowed it to sort of get through, and they didn't keep pushing it down. So that's, I think, one fault line is the role of general and special revelation.
Hello and welcome to the Reformation Red Pill podcast, brought to you by the Forge Press. I am your host, Joshua Haymes. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I'm sure you're looking around and saying, Joshua, where is Pastor Brooks? Well, he's not here today because, in fact, this episode that we are about to give you for free is our backstage Patreon exclusive episode that I did with Joe Rigney, specifically as a follow-up discussion to the classic two kingdoms versus sphere sovereignty conversation that we had with Dr. Joe Boot and Dr. Joe Rigney. It was just too good to keep to ourselves. So we are giving it to you for free. With that, my hope is that it will motivate you who've been on the fence for weeks now to just go ahead and do it. Just join our Patreon. You know, you've been thinking about it. You want to support this podcast. You want to get that backstage access. You want to get into our Discord. Just go ahead and do it. Please, we need you, right? We actually do need you. And you get tons of good stuff like this episode that is coming up. Specifically, I want to ask you to join our Knox tier. Knox tier, we're trying to get 100 Knox tier subscribers by the end of the year. That's our goal. We'll see if we can get it. You get tons of stuff. You get our Metaviscar Tumblr. You get access to an entirely different podcast called Dark Roasted, which is where I am debating baptism with one of my best friends. But we're also just going to start talking theology and what's going on Reformed Twitter and what's the news of the day, that kind of thing. So with that is my invitation. Join our Patreon. For all you guys who are already Patreon subscribers, thank you so much. You are making this podcast possible. Literally, we couldn't do it without you. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys view this wonderful Patreon exclusive episode that we are giving you for free. So enjoy this conversation with Joe Rigney. Okay, here we are backstage with Dr. Rigney. Looking forward to this. So you had just mentioned, so we're right now, for anyone if you haven't watched the episode that we just did with Dr. Boot, you should watch that before you engage with this, because this is going to be basically an analysis and then a furthering of the conversation. The differences and the distinctions between classic two kingdoms, the use of natural law, and Kuyperian sphere sovereignty and theonomy. So you had something that you mentioned to me right when we got off about some of these distinctions. I'll let you jump into that, Dr. Rigney.
Yeah, so I've had lots of conversations about this over, especially the last 10 years, and I can understand why people get really confused, why people who ostensibly ascribe to the same sort of statement of faith, they're all Reformed, they're all Calvinists, but seem to just get stuck in circles and running around each other when it comes to political philosophy. And people that you think, oh, they're probably on the same team, all of a sudden you find out, no, there's some big division and I don't really understand it. And so I've done a lot of thinking about that. And I think, and if you've listened to the episode of Dr. Boot, there's a couple of kind of key, what I would call fault lines. Sort of these are the places where if you answer this question, yes, if you answer it, no, you're going to fall out one way or another. But there's a series of them, which is why it's not as simple, so that you can find yourself kind of in strange places because you agree with someone on one thing, but not on one of these other questions. And so it gets a little confusing. So one of them I think that came up pretty consistently is the question of general and special revelation. And I don't think I really realized it until the end, how kind of a central, I think, a difference is. So when Dr. Boot would talk about sort of the three senses of the word of creation, the incarnate word, and the scripturated word, even when he would point to the word of creation, he would typically be quoting Genesis. Okay. So there's 10 words in Genesis, 10 commands or 10 declarations in Genesis, which sort of he was drawing a comparison. And it was like, that was a little light bulb, like, oh, okay, I know what this is now. I do think it's important to kind of make a distinction between.
Can you tell them what that's referring to, the 10 words in Genesis?
Yeah, so I think there's 10 statements that God makes over the 7 days. There's not 7 creative acts. There's 10 because there's 2 acts on day 3. There's 2 acts on day 6, and then there's the addition. There's one more. So like it's not so you get 7 days, but you actually get 10 sort of let there be kind of statements. So the plants are made. The plants are made on the same day that the waters are separated from the land. So I think that I assume that's what he's referring to. Which I think it's in theonomy circles. I think that's a common connecting point.
Yeah.
But I've kind of over the years come to distinguish between what you might call facts of creation from facts of nature. So oftentimes creation and nature get used as sort of synonyms in these discussions. And I don't think that they're the same. Facts of nature, which is where I'd put things like natural law and general revelation, are things that we know by nature, things that are accessible to all men everywhere simply because they're creatures and they live in God's world. There's no Bible involved whatsoever. It's just, what do you know by nature? Heavens declare the glory. Conversation that you mentioned in the episode about the birds testify to God's care and compassion, therefore don't be anxious. There you have both a revelation revealing something about God and a sort of duty. Don't be anxious. So there's both revelation and law kind of together in Jesus's words, which Jesus helps us out, gives us the shortcut. We don't have to do all of the thinking by ourselves. He just says, look, and this is what you're supposed to see. So that's facts of nature. Facts of creation is special revelation. It's things that are testified to in the Bible. You need a Bible to know them. So the order in which God made the earth is something that you couldn't know simply by natural reflection. You don't get there simply by reflecting on your own nature or even looking at history and reading rocks. In order to get that God said, let there be light on day 1 and then separated the waters from the waters on day 2, you need a Bible. So those are facts of creation, and they do matter. And oftentimes facts of creation is what sort of is the biblical explanation for facts of nature. So this is how God did it in the beginning, and that's why the world's that way. I've used this a lot in discussions of like manhood and womanhood. So God takes Adam from the dust of the ground. God takes Eve from Adam's side. God orients Adam to the ground. God orients Eve to Adam as a helper. And it's like those are all facts of creation. You need a Bible to know those. You're not going to know those by nature.
Yeah.
Right? But it does give rise to certain facts of nature. It's why men tend to be more outward oriented, thing oriented, task oriented. Women tend to be more people oriented. I think there's a correspondence between those. But those second facts, men are more this way, women are more that way, are things that anybody with 2 eyes in their head could know. Right? So those are facts of nature. And so when we talk about natural law, when I'm talking about natural law, when I think the tradition's talking, it's talking about the facts of nature side, things that are evident to all men everywhere, not necessarily facts of creation, which you need a Bible to know. Right. So I think that, and I think that what you look to natural revelation to do, or what it's capable of doing in principle, is a key dividing line. So I think that there's a lot of stuff that's clearly, this is the Romans 1 text. It's clearly revealed. Things about God, things about us, things about the world that are clearly revealed. Now, Dr. Boot is going to come back and say, yeah, but we're sinners and we suppress the truth. And I want to say yes and amen. That's absolutely right. We do. But it's a truth suppression, which means the truth is there and evident and obvious and pressing. And sometimes, by God's gracious superintendence, certain even non-Christians can sort of recognize it. So I think this is how we account for some of the accuracy, at least of Aristotle and Plato and some of the philosophers, is in that case, the pressing of the light of nature, God graciously allowed it to sort of get through, and they didn't keep pushing it down. So that's, I think, one fault line is the role of general and special revelation. What can general revelation get you, and how does special revelation relate? It amplifies, clarifies natural law, but it doesn't introduce it. So that's I think one what you look to nature and scripture to do. That's one thing. The other one that was kind of interesting that came up at the end was the question of competence, which I would tie into the question of authorization. So this is another place, and it's tied to the general special revelation. Because I think God made the world in a certain way, we're by nature political. I think we are by nature political animals, which means sociable. We're not isolated individuals. We gather in groups. We want shared life. God made us this way, Genesis 1, right? Male and female, he made them and gave them the commission. And because of that, everywhere you look, humans are always gathering. That's a natural revealed truth. But because of that, I don't think that I need this kind of explicit authorization for every little thing, like special revelation authorization, right, for the state. Whereas I think certain Christians this is the Christians like the Baptist and Van Drunen, who really want to anchor everything in the Noahic covenant, right? It's like that one passage like bears the load of a whole lot of their political philosophy. The common kingdom, the restrictions and limitations. It's about horizontal harm. If you harm a human, you can be put to death. That sort of thing is because there's a specific Bible verse that authorizes it,
right,
and that therefore establishes the competence of the state to do that task.
Because it's explicit. All they got to do is look at Deuteronomy 22.
Correct.
Yeah.
So there's the authorization competence question. Whereas I don't, because of natural revelation, I don't feel the same compulsion. I'm glad for it. I'm glad that Genesis 9 does clarify this. But the question would be, if you didn't know Genesis 9, if you don't know the Bible and you live in a pagan country, does the state, can you still punish murder? And it's like, yeah, I think it's because it's natural law. Like natural law is written on your heart that you're obligated to love God, you're obligated to love nature. These are things that are rooted in what you are. And so you don't need to know Genesis 9 to know that if someone kills a man, you can kill them back as a punishment. That's rationally discernible in principle. Now men suppress it and whatever, but it's there to be known.
One question then is, because you bring up what Booth's rejoinder would be, which was that men suppress it. So, but if that's true and men do suppress it, why would you have confidence that isn't constantly happening? That is not constantly being suppressed, and that we can have confidence that a civil magistrate, isn't suppressing that, these truths that, like you say, are self-evident to a degree. On what basis can we have confidence that the civil magistrate or whoever isn't suppressing that at any given time?
So I think this is where, like, just the facts on the ground, like most nations have laws against murder, right? Almost all nations have laws against murder. In fact, one of the ways that you can see the persistence of that law is that it's really rare that you'll find any sustainable people that says the killing of innocents is okay.
Right.
It's always, there's an exception. There's the law. You can't kill innocents. You can't kill innocent people. But that group of people, either they're not people, right? Like the unborn children, they're not people. So so even people today, when liberals argue for abortion, they're hat tipping natural law, because if they won't bite the bullet and say, yes, these are innocent human beings and it's okay for us to kill them. They always have to go, no, it's a clump of cells. The same thing's true of, historic, conflicts. Well, that people group's not human. They're subhuman. So we can enslave them. We can kill them.
Well, even to push back on that a little bit, I don't know if we're reaching a point of truth suppression where now some of the conversation is, that's a human being, but guess what? The woman is more important and I value her more. And so you can kill that little innocent human. It doesn't matter as much. Now, to your point, they're still doing like the kind of the existentialist move and saying, like, yeah, it's a human, but it's not a person. A lot of them will they'll be making that. So but we may even be approaching the point where it's like, it doesn't matter if it's a person. This is what we want to do. This is inconvenient. We want to get anyway. But I'd see your main point being that in general, even depraved societies aren't allowing you to just kill innocent people.
Yeah, with abandon. Like, so the law is always there. And I think Lewis in Abolition of Man,
Mhm.
you know, in the appendix sort of lists out, here's sort of natural law, sort of from different cultures. You know, Confucius said this and the Hindu Vedas say that. And a lot of them are going to be sort of the basic dictates of natural law that correspond roughly to the 10 Commandments.
Tao.
So the Tao, right, exactly, the Tao. So the Tao is persistent, even though men suppress it, and in modern society are getting more and more flamboyantly rebellious against it.
Mhm.
But that's part of the thing, is it's an actual rebellion. If it wasn't there, they wouldn't need to rebel. If it wasn't pressing on their conscience, they wouldn't need all of the rationalizations and excuses, the exception clauses and things like that. That's how you know it's there. And then what you have in certain cases, I think, in noble pagans, if you want to call them that, by virtue, I think, of God's gracious work, common grace, that kind of thing, has enabled them to kind of embrace that and say, yeah, actually, society's better. Thomas Jefferson, right? Society's better when we respect each other's property and things like that. And so he's not born again, but he can recognize it. And then I think the other thing that comes in all these discussions that you have to keep in mind is that in the actual course of history, we never encounter a society that only has natural revelation. Every society at this point almost has some vestiges of special revelation. So if you're in Christendom, you certainly have that.
Yeah.
Even Islam, because Islam is a Christian heresy, has downstream sort of, it's got stuff in the background. Even pagan nations have Noahic special revelation somewhere in the background, right? Everybody comes from Noah and his sons. Everybody came from Babel. And so even there, and then it's been refreshed. They encounter Jews. The Jews are scattered among the nations, and therefore people come into contact with special revelation. So even modern religions or modern societies, pagan societies, have some vestiges of special revelation that have kind of, I think, buttressed or sharpened, hey, that's actually a good law. That natural law that you recognized, yes, and then they go with it. So here's where then the division comes. So I said that the authorization question is a real one, right? Do you think that every institution has to have a explicit special revelation authorization in order to function, and that authorization acts as a kind of restriction? So you can do stuff in these bounds, but no farther. And so that's one question. Then it's what's it authorized to do? So for Dr. Boot, he's going to say, honor God is a part of what the state's authorized to do. It needs to acknowledge where it got the sword. But others, like Van Drunen, perhaps, although he's a little bit iffy, but certainly Baptists often will say first table of the law stuff is not authorized to the state. That's vertical, and so it's not horizontal. And so because the state's not authorized to bear the sword in relation to worship and so forth, blasphemy laws are out altogether. Even any kind of acknowledgement of the living God is out, or at bare minimum, it's nature's God, not the Christian, not Christ. And so that's a place where I think on the one principle we have to have authorization. Dr. Boot's position and say Baptist and R2K would be in the same spot. We're all looking for authorization. The difference is when they read the Bible, Dr. Boot says the state is authorized to do more, and the Baptists are like it's authorized to do less. So it's a degree thing, but they're doing the same activity. They're looking for authorization, which for them defines competence. Is the state competent to recognize the living God? Is the state competent to recognize heresy or not? Those all kind of come on that side of the equation. Whereas for me, I go, look, the dictates of natural law is worship the true God. That natural law teaches you that. I don't need a Bible verse that says every institution of society, every individual, every institution needs to acknowledge and uphold that fact. One other, maybe two other questions that kind of, I think, help sort is the relevance of the Old Testament. This was less of an issue in our discussion with Dr. Boot because we're on the same side. We both believe that the Old Testament has relevance for informing our political philosophy. It's going to be a question of where and how. Do we look at the civil laws and the civil punishments of the Mosaic economy and say that establishes the way we should do it?
Well, yeah, even on that note, I just finished a book called The Case for Public Stoning. Right. And it was a theonomist who was basically saying this is the law of God, and these punishments that he laid out in the Old Testament, they're good, and they're good for us today.
Yep.
And not only interestingly, I liked what Joe said, and I think that this is true biblically, which was that the capital punishments that we see in the Mosaic law were maximum punishments, and they weren't always carried out.
Correct.
But this guy in the public stoning thing, he did not take. He was like, if you know, someone who commits adultery should be stoned. But interestingly, he similarly does not give that authority to the state. He says that the church should have exercise its own law, essentially, and that the church should covenant together to stone like adulterers.
Yeah. Right. So I think
within their community, not outside.
Yeah. And so I think
Yeah.
there's just layers of confusions there. And this is where I think there would, so if Dr. Boot and I were interacting with that fella, we'd have things like, no, there are different jurisdictions in terms, and both in Israel and in the modern day, between sort of ecclesiastical jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction. And they're not the same. Priests and kings were separate in the Old Testament. There was a priesthood, and then there was magistrates. And so this is actually a very kind of classical Reformed way to do it. There's books called like the Hebrew Polity or the Hebrew Republic, where essentially what they would do, the Reformed theologians would look at the Israel as a model polity, but not one that's like binding. It's what do we learn from Israel? And so that's the relevance of the Old Testament. And this is where things like the tripartite division of the law comes from, where we distinguish between that moral law, that natural law principle that's universal, the ceremonial law, which is symbolic and points to grace and points to redemption, and the civil law, which applies that natural law principle in Israel's life. These are the punishments here, whether it's maximum punishments or minimum punishments or whatnot. And the distinctions among that division, that attempt to kind of analyze the law was then, okay, we're going to bring over the moral law. That has to stay because that's universally binding. The ceremonial stuff's been fulfilled in Christ, but we can still learn things from it. It teaches us about Christ. It points to Christ, and therefore we look at the sacrificial system in order to worship Jesus better. And it might even inform some of the things we do, our liturgies or something. And then the civil law has been abrogated. We're not under that covenant, but this is where I would say, but we can consult it as wisdom. Okay, so this in an ancient Near Eastern society, it was a small republic. This was the sort of punishments that were fitting in that time, and you don't see prisons.
Can I interject for a second? And to distinguish what you're saying from the Joe Boots of the world and the general equity theonomists of the world, they're going to want to say that while yes, the specific civil laws were abrogated, the general equity of those civil laws, not only were they not abrogated, but we should be actively applying. Or we have a responsibility, rather, to actively apply the general equity of those laws to our current legislation, our current situation. And it seems like you're wanting to say, no, we don't have an obligation to necessarily apply the general equity of all those laws, though we can consult them accordingly.
Men, you need meat. But you also need to stop giving your money to meat companies that hate Christ and pack their meat snacks full of sugar, soy, nitrates, and fillers. Now, listen, I'm a huge fan of beef jerky, or at least I was until I discovered Farmer Bill's Biltong. Biltong is a cured meat snack without all the sugars, chemicals, and preservatives that the big jerky companies use. Farmer Bill's is a Christian company that sources all their beef and bison from the grasslands of South Dakota. American made. They sell pre-sliced biltong, which is better than jerky, as well as 1-pound charcuterie slabs. And guys, there's really just no other way to say this. It is delicious. Farmer Bill's Biltong is now quite literally a part of my daily diet.
I highly recommend their bestseller bundle to start off with. It includes the 4-flavor variety pack, a half-pound original slab, as well as their grass-fed tallow bomb. And they even include free shipping.
One last thing. Do not forget to use code REFORMATION at checkout. It gets you 10% off your entire order, and this is very important, it lets them know that we sent you. So, click the link in the description and get your first batch of biltong from Farmer Bill's today.
Well, Joshua, I don't really know exactly how to say this, and I know our viewers can't tell, But you really stink, brother.
Well, Pastor Brooks, I'm glad you brought that up. I stink because I am swearing off soap.
No. Now, you know I'm not one to buy the conscience, but for the sake of your dear wife, you cannot swear off soap.
Well, what am I supposed to do, Pastor Brooks? All these soap companies are either A, pumping their soaps full of all kind of unnatural chemicals that are doing who knows what to our bodies, or B, these natural soap companies are run by pagans who support all kind of evil nonsense. And that's why, until I can find a soap company that uses natural ingredients and has incredible masculine and feminine fragrances, as well as an unscented option for when I want to get clean, but I want to be subtle about it.
Sure.
Yeah, and is thoroughly Christian. And for good measure, I would like the founders of this company to look like Nephilim. Until I can find that soap company, I am swearing off soap.
Well, Joshua, I have got good news for you. Because our sponsor, Indigo Sundries Soap Company, checks off literally every single one of your soap company demands, including that strangely specific one about the Nephilim.
That's important.
Not only that, but for all of our listeners, they're offering 10% off the entire order with code Reformation, plus free shipping for all orders over $50.
Wow, Pastor Brooks, wow. I think I'm finally ready to stop stinking and buy my soap from an awesome Christian soap company.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd say that, Joshua. I recommend the 10-bar bundle.
Will you put our favorite scents in the description?
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a fair?
No, close. I think it's about how we define the general equity. So
Okay.
for me, the general equity of the civil laws is the moral and natural law.
Right. Wouldn't the theonomists say that too?
Right, but that's the thing. So I'm saying we should apply so I would agree. So I think when the guys around here talk about we're general equity theonomists as distinct from sort of classical theonomists and reconstructionists, I think on a lot of substantive things we'll be in the same spot. Where the difference actually comes with me and say when Toby and I've had these sort of discussions. I think it's more that there's I don't mean this pejoratively. There's a biblicism. I have more stuff in my prudence bucket. Where I'm like, yeah, that's a good way to do it, but it's not the only way to do it. Whereas I think there's a more restrictives, maybe the right word, like a particularizing, like, no, this is the biblical way. And so it's the best way. Even if there may be other ways, this is the best way. And so I go, yeah,
then your way is wrong because it's not the biblical way.
Yeah, it can kind of lead to that. So and I think that your question about penitentiaries is a good example where I think certain folks are going to, and I think Dr. Boot was gesturing this way, right? As he's going like, yeah, no, this is not a good way. And he gave all sorts of facts why it wasn't, like facts on the ground. Yeah. But that's because
you would probably agree with.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, that I would say, yeah, like all that sounds terrible. And I haven't studied prison, so I don't know. But like in my head, the question is going to be, is it effective at doing what we want it to do? Like, does it deter crime? Is it a fitting retribution? So retribution is a part of the general equity. Is it fitting retribution? And does it accomplish the ends of, say, protecting right worship, protecting life, protecting marriage, protecting property? Those are the fundamental duties of universal natural moral law. Is all of the no's, the thou shalt nots of the 10 Commandments are the negative side of positive duties. So you shall have no other gods means worship the Lord, protect worship, worship God in the way He prescribes. That's the second commandment. Guard the sanctity of God's name and live accordingly. Honor the Sabbath, right? Honor your parents. Those are positive; they're not negative. Then you've got protect life, protect marriage, protect property, protect reputation, and then guard your heart. With the coveting. So there's positive and negative duties associated with all of the 10 words. And we're after the positive obedience. And then it's what means will be good means to get there. Which again, this is where he objected. This I think is another question though. It was interesting that he objected to it. I was surprised by this. When I did a kind of analogy between the state and the family. This is one of my kind of rough and ready tools, I guess, like one of my rough and ready, when I'm debating with folks trying to figure out where do we disagree, and they'll say the state can't do X. I immediately in my head go, well, could a dad do it? And the reason is because in my mind, the family and the state have this in common. They're both natural institutions.
And okay, do you think Dr. Boot would agree with that statement that they are natural institutions?
Yeah, they're natural. They're natural institutions. They're not established by by special revelation, grace, like the church. The church is institution established by the gospel, right? The preaching of the gospel establishes the church just for what it is.
Sure.
The state and the family both are natural. And
Mhm.
so they operate according to, I think, analogous principles. Now, the rod and the sword are different. Parents can't execute their kids, right? I'm granting all of that. But usually in my arguments with Baptists, when they say the state can't, say, coerce you into doing something, I'll go, okay, well, I got to figure out what you mean by the word coerce.
Mhm.
Can I make my kids go to church? Is that an act of coercion? Am
Mm.
I violating some fundamental aspect of their human nature by making my kids go to church? And most, even Baptists, are going to go, well, of course not. You have the right, you're authorized to take your kids to church. Even though they may, from a Baptist view, they're not Christians yet, they're not baptized. I'm making them go to church.
Mhm.
Am I coercing them? No, I can't coerce their faith. I can't change their heart, but I can put them in a situation where they're going to hear the gospel preached. Am I authorized to do that without violating their integrity as a human? And everybody's going to say, yeah, you do. Okay. So what that means is not all compulsion, right, is coercive in a forbidden sense.
Sure.
You can have Sabbath laws.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a defeater. It's like, hey, if you've established as a fundamental political principle something that makes it impossible for parents to spank their kids, then your principle's wrong. That's how I use that. So anytime you go read people and they're saying the state can or the state can't, just try it. Say substitute family government, substitute father for magistrate, and see what happens. See, does it illuminate like where there might be a misunderstanding? So I find that a really useful kind of tool to kind of get where the differences might be. So the other piece on the imitate Israel. So Dr. Boot and I think would be in the similar spot, and yeah, we can look to Israel. Whereas I would say typically Baptists and sometimes the R2K guys view Israel as sort of like the exception, not the norm.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I think this is a major dividing line in most political philosophy discussions among Christians. If you say Israel is sort of this, it's a special people, everybody says that, but is it a model people, or is its uniqueness such that you can't imitate it?
Mm-hmm.
Or the only imitation can be sort of the church imitates it, but not in its, but excommunication has now replaced execution and that sort of move, which is what a lot of folks will want to do. I think that's a major dividing line. If you don't think that you can look at Josiah and say, we want rulers like Josiah, right? Who are going to throw down high places, reestablish right worship. I want rulers like Josiah. Like that would be great.
And would Joe, do you think Joe, is that you would put Joe in the agree on that? You think?
Yeah, I think that he and I would probably agree on that.
That
we would both look and say that. Now, one of the differences would be the actual. So let's stick there though. Just can you look to the Old Testament as a model, or is Israel unique and you can't imitate it? Modern nations should not look to Israel for wisdom about governance, right? Then you move to, I think this is where Dr. Boot and I were different, is the sphere sovereignty thing. And this is something that's been more recent for me, a realization, because I've used that. I've now stopped using sphere sovereignty as the term for it, because I realized that there's a real sharp division in jurisdiction that's in view here. He did say at one point in the conversation, though, he mentioned Dewey Weird or whoever it is has interlacements. And I was like, I'm curious there. What does that mean? Where that sounded to me like family and church and state might work together in certain kind of ways to do things. And I'm like, if you allow for that, then maybe we're not so far apart. But this is why I don't have, when I read the classic Reformed confessions, Westminster 1646, Belgic Confession, which give the state a role in promoting right worship. It's not the state doesn't preach the word. The state doesn't administer the sacraments. The state doesn't exercise even church discipline, but the state does create cultural conditions conducive to right worship. I can't remember how. I think it's the Westminster says, this is 1646.
Right.
It's his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed. Now, that's a really strong duty given to the magistrate, right? And I think that's in bounds. I would then have questions about how's it going to do that? Is it going to do it in a counterproductive, stupid way that's going to actually make blasphemy and heresy flourish and
Would Boone
thrive.
agree? I can't remember, like, because I know that he agreed on the blasphemy side of things, but it seems like he might agree on the suppression of heresy, but not because we talked about.
I think that what he does, we didn't get into this, but the
Yeah.
question would be, so that's 1646. That's the London Westminster.
Uh-huh.
The American version alters that paragraph.
Right.
And precisely, I think, because of a changing circumstance. So
Mhm.
I look at, there was an article recently that Kevin DeYoung wrote about the differences between Westminster 1646 and Westminster 1789, the American and the British. And he was presenting it as a disjunction. You have to pick London or Philadelphia. You can't. Whereas my read is much more, there's common Presbyterian political principles that are now being applied in two very different contexts. And so there is a common core of principle between 1646 and 1789. But 1789 has now adjusted itself in terms of its application for an American context in which you have multiple denominations, and it doesn't want the state adjudicating among them. So it's the American version is American, and I think that's great. I don't have any issues and think, it's still the American version still says the state is a nursing father, which is interesting in light of the family state comparison. The state's a nursing father, drawn from Isaiah, but should promote the church, right? Should seek the flourishing of the church, not just religion, but like promote the church as a distinct entity and just not picking among denominations. I think that both the London and the Philadelphia are lawful. I just think they're different applications of shared principles. And I think this would be a third or maybe a fourth, whatever number we're on now, question. Sometimes what happens is people take a wise application of good principles and they make it a new principle.
Okay.
So they take this is an application of a principle in a particular place. And then because we're uncomfortable saying, hey, this is just one application of it, we typically want to shore it up by making it the only way to do it. And so now the application becomes its own principle. And so this is, I think, what's happening actually with the neo-Calvinists, the Dutch Reformed, Kuyper, those guys, is in some ways, I'm real sympathetic to the idea that they are trying to apply Reformed political principles in the Netherlands at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And they're looking at the facts on the ground, and you have a compromised sort of liberal church. You've got now separatist churches, so dissenting churches in the Netherlands, which they're a part of. There's still a lot of popular support for real Christianity. They could actually get elected, which Kuyper does. And they're trying to go but our confession basically says that the state church, or the national church, is the church. What do we do? And so I get the need to kind of adapt. Where I think the mistake gets made is rather than simply saying, hey, we need to apply our principles differently in these new circumstances, Kuyper invents a new principle. He brings in new principles and says, no, the principle, he says, I'm not making this argument on prudential grounds. I was just reading about this. He says, we oppose the Belgic Confession, Article 36, which is their magistrate one. We oppose it out of complete conviction. Right. This is a convictional thing. And so now as a result, they've taken what I would say is if neo-Calvinism, if Kuyperianism was a application of reform principles to the Netherlands, given the facts on the ground, why attempt at a wise application? I go, great. If it's, however, they view it, which I think is how Kuyper viewed it, as a breaking with the Reformed tradition, based on, in their mind, further biblical reflection on the nature of the church, the nature of the state, this sphere sovereignty idea, hard and fast lines, state needs to stay out of our denominational business whatsoever. That's a change. That's an alteration of principle. And I'll say, I don't go there. So sphere sovereignty as a wisdom principle, yes. That kind of adaptation as a application, yes.
Yeah.
But if it entails, which I think it does, a sort of protection of principled pluralism, okay? So it's not just, maybe this is another way to put it. It's one thing to say, hey, we live in a pluralistic society and we've got to do the best we can to apply God's law to it. It's another thing to say, no, we're principled pluralists. this is now our principle. We're going to ensure pluralism, which is, I think, just ensuring polytheism. We're going to ensure pluralism across the board at all times in all places. This is now the law. That's a different move. And so I think this is a key question for people as they're wrestling through it. What are your principles and what are your prudential applications? Like, which, make sure you get those in the right place. Otherwise, you give your own applications a promotion and you say, now this is the way to do it, the biblical, the only way. And I think a lot of times it's, no, that's a good way.
Yeah.
Great. But it's not the only way.
Do you see a lot of, so that's a helpful way of framing it. And I've even heard Joel Webbin say that like, okay, yeah, even when I interviewed him last year with well, he was talking about Stephen Wolfe and saying that, yeah, he and sounds like you have claims on Calvin in a way that the neo-Calvinists, like he would say, like myself and others, do not. And so do you think that there's a recognition of kind of what you just said, that taking this application and turning it into a principle? Do you think that most of the sphere sovereignty, Kuyperian, theonomic folks acknowledge that, or are they still are they trying to say, that this is actually just a wise application of the basic reform principles? Do you see an acknowledgement of it?
No, I think it is more that they view it as this is part of the principle. So I think this is why there's an interesting kind of coalescing of sort of Kuyperian, theonomic, theocratic libertarianism. And I think that's so in other words, and the libertarianism comes from a real sharp sphere sovereignty. The state needs to stay out of this altogether. The state has no role. The state needs to do like 5 things and that's it. The church, the family, private enterprise does everything else. And I have libertarian, I guess, sort of instincts in some ways. Like I think generally, like, yeah, we should stay out. Like I like limited government, small government. But in my mind, a lot of that's prudential. So in a big, massive country, diverse country with hundreds of millions of people, I don't want Leviathan. But if I lived in Geneva, right? If it's Geneva, and Geneva is the highest government that we have to work with. We don't have to worry about really anybody else. Maybe there's an emperor somewhere who does some stuff, but like it's largely the only government I have to deal with is the Genevan City Council. Then I go, I may actually have a stronger and more robust vision of what that government should do, given the smallness of the population, things like that. So
I don't 2 thumbs up for the consistory.
Yeah. So I don't know if I give 2 thumbs up, but at least the idea, because I'm ignorant.
Yeah.
But like the idea that like there would be this like, hey, let's have the churches in town and the state kind of get together to figure out like how we can work together to solve problems. It's not there's a hard and fast line, church stay over here, state stay over here in that same way. Like there's a general institutional difference. The state is the ministry of justice. The church is the ministry of word and sacrament. The family is the ministry of health and procreation and industry. I get that. They have different, you've got the sword and the rod and the keys. I'm all good with this. But when it becomes a hardened and fast and kind of particularized thing, I think we're taking stuff from the prudence bucket and turning it into principle. And I don't think that my experience is most theonomic guys don't recognize that's what they're doing. Or they would say, yeah, it is a principle. Like it's the Bible. So a good example of this is where some theonomists will look at, the guys around here do this. And I'm like sympathetic at one level on prudence grounds, but not as an absolute principle. They look at the taxation stuff from the Old Testament and they're like, it was tyranny when they taxed them at 10%. And if only we could get back to that level of tyranny, right? So they view that example from Israel's history of 10% taxation as sort of a limit, because it's like God required 10%. And so for the state to require 10% is tyranny. And I go, I get it. I don't love tax, like high taxation, but I would not elevate that into a hard and fast biblical principle. That for a state to tax people at 15% is somehow has usurped God's place and become a tyrant because it's claiming more wealth than God does in a tithe. I just go, I don't think that's how it works. That's not how it's wisdom, not law. I would want it to be wisdom, not law.
I see that. Problem is talking to you, Dr. Rigney, is that's eminently reasonable.
Yeah. Sorry for being so eminently reasonable.
No, but I know you probably got to get going here, but I want to know, like, so you're not a theonomist. What I've been telling people for the last year or so, since I began about 2.5 years ago, I started really looking into, like, all right, theonomy as a system and what it all means. And I call myself a tentative theonomist because I've been convinced of some primary. There's a great article that Toby did a while back called "Everyone's a Theonomist." He kind of makes
sure.
And
in that sense, I would own it. So, like, I would assume that if Mother Jones writes an article and describes what theonomy means or something, the liberals are going to call all of us theonomists.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I would say yes, I'm in favor of God's law. Are you a theocrat? Yes, I'm in favor of God's law. I want rule by God. Yes, we are. So yes.
Right.
So yeah, in those senses, I am. It's more in that kind of.
But that article kind of divorces that. The problem with it, which I appreciate, he kind of puts some categories. He gives categories for Christians who, like, they get scared and freaked out when they hear the word theonomy, and I think he's trying to make it more palatable to them. The problem is that it divorces what the actual tradition of theonomy, like the on the ground realities of what the specifics. It's a specific tradition with specific, and so it kind of divorces that from those specifics to try to make a broader point. And so, getting into the specifics a little bit, why you say, yes, I would call myself that if Mother Jones wrote the article, but you won't call yourself that based on some of the specifics of what that. Can you get into that just a little bit?
Yeah, and it's because of that. I think at least from and some of it is just where I learned stuff. So one of the things that I think became evident when I kind of skimmed through Dr. Booth's book in preparation for our discussion, just to see, like, okay, would I find stuff where I would say I disagree with this, and I didn't really in the book. And but part of the reason is that his intellectual architecture is different than mine. I think by virtue of who he studied with, who he learned, what books he read. This is what Doug and I discover a lot whenever we talk about this stuff. Doug went through a Reconstructionist phase where he read all the things that Rushdoony had ever written and got a lot of help, even though he didn't end up landing as a pure Reconstructionist. But he went through a Van Til phase, and so has a real strong presuppositional Van Tillian streak in him. I did not. Right. That's not, I read Van Til in college, found some of it helpful, but then started to realize there's a weirdness here that I don't go with. And it really does it has to do with the clarity of natural revelation, I think, even in a fallen world, which is why I don't mind. So I'm on apologetics, right? Like these things all dovetail. I think the theonomic, libertarian, Kuyperian guys tend to be Van Tillian, presuppositionalists, and really sometimes have a hostility to classical apologetics, historical apologetics, things like that. I don't. I'm like, use all of them, right? Yeah. Historical apologetics, the classical proofs, and the presuppositional ways. I'm a all of the above guy.
Doug say that too. I feel like
Doug would totally say that, right? Yeah. Which is why he and I can have, we can talk about this, but I don't even have kind of like the hardcore Van Tillian DNA in my intellectual furniture. Instead, most of my political philosophy, where did it come from? Well, it came from reading Althusius, Richard Hooker, Calvin. It came from reading the Davenant Trust guys as they were the Calvinist International, all of which is Magisterial Two Kingdoms, which was self-consciously, I think, like in terms of like intellectual, like recent intellectual history, I think part of what's happened is I think theonomy is itself a divergence from the classical Reformed tradition, like Rushdoony, and I think Kuyperianism is a divergence. I think in both cases they think of themselves as sort of finishing the job, right? Calvin and these guys didn't go far enough. We're finishing the job, making it fully Reformed, fully biblical. But but there's a difference between Kuyper, Rushdoony, and even between them. But from those guys and say Calvin and Althusius and the Reformed Scholastics. Okay. And then what happens is that's the 70s and 80s. There's kind of a reaction to that among the Reformed. And so a lot of like contemporary, like PCA, OPC type guys are defining themselves over against theonomy and Reconstruction, but they're not actually recovering Calvin and the Reformers. they have a kind of their own modification of that tradition.
That's the radical two
And
kingdoms.
this is the R2K guys. So the R2K guys. And so in both cases, you have what I would call distinctly American modifications of the Reformed tradition. You have a theonomic variation of the Reformed tradition that's trying to further purify it. You have a R2K version of the Reformed tradition that's trying to purify it, and I think adapt it to kind of classical liberalism. And that's the key thing, is I think Theonomy wants to say, we like certain things of classical liberalism. There's the libertarian piece. But we want God's law across the board, and we think God's law does give us this kind of liberty. Okay. Then I think the R2K guys say, no, Theonomy is going to kill it because it's going to be tyranny, theocracy, heavy-handed persecution of, Baptists and whatnot. And so they kind of create a much larger secular space through their common kingdom idea, the Noahic covenant. And Baptists really gravitate to that. Baptists love reading Van Drunen and drawing from him. And they, I think, like reading Kuyper, because I think Kuyper is a separatist in this regard. He's trying to carve out space for a free church and a free state. And Baptists are like, ding, 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 that's what we are. Free church, free state.
Proverbs 13:22 tells us that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Well, if you're anything like me, you want to be a good, godly man, a man who provides for his family, a man who wisely stewards the financial resources that God has given him. And man, is that hard to do in today's economy. Now, I have personally spoken with multiple financial advisors, and I want you guys to know that I am personally using Joe Garrissey and his team at Backwards Planning Financial. Maybe you thought like I have. I wish that I had started investing years ago for my family's financial future. Maybe then me and my family would be in a better financial position. Listen, it's never too late to start. Joe Garrissey with Backwards Planning Financial works hard to help families achieve their financial goals. He's a Christian who works with one of the largest and most trusted financial service companies in the world. Whether you have millions in assets or you're just now getting started investing, Joe Garrissey can help you reach your financial goals. Visit backwardsplanningfinancial.com or call Joe Garrissey at 615-767-2555. If you are anything like me, you would love to start reading the Puritans, you just don't know where to begin. Reformation Heritage Books has the solution. Their collection, Puritan Treasures for Today, makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. We need the wisdom of the Puritans for the ongoing work of Reformation today. Learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. The link will be in the show notes below. Also, Reformation Heritage Books is offering a 10% discount for all our listeners. All you have to do is enter code REFORMATION at checkout. Now, don't forget that part. Not only does the discount code get you 10% off, it also lets them know that we sent you, which incentivizes them to continue sponsoring this podcast so that we can keep bringing you Reformation content. Now, let's get back to the show.
Meanwhile, in all of this, the actual Reformed tradition, the Luther to Calvin to Hooker, the Althusius, the Junius, all of these sort of things, in some cases, they just weren't available. Like some of those books have only been kind of translated and reproduced at a wide level over the last 15 to 20 years. So they weren't available in the 70s and 80s. Calvin was, obviously, Luther was, but there was confusion about what they taught. And then now you had, I think Davenant was a really significant influence in this, in sort of ressourcement. Let's go back and bring these guys out from the archives. And what they discovered was, two kingdoms isn't church versus state. That's not the two kingdoms. Like these guys are saying two kingdoms is church versus state. That ain't it. It's inner man and outer man. It's spiritual, direct to God, no mediation. It's just you and God and your conscience. And then it's the temporal sphere, the earthly sphere, the bodily sphere, and the visible church is in the temporal kingdom. It's an institution that's ordered in many cases according to natural law principles. Westminster says this, right? There's many aspects of church government that are just like, this is a good way to do it. This is wisdom, not prescribed divine law. And so it's that recovery, I think, over the last 15 to 20 years that has actually kind of upended what everybody felt like was stable debates. You had your theonomists, you had your Kuyperians, you had your R2K guys, you had your Baptists, and everybody was like, yeah, we know where we're at. And then I think the recovery of the magisterial tradition scrambled it, because in certain cases, the magisterial, what I am, agrees with theonomists about everything needs to be submitted to Christ, but disagrees about Moses and the role of the law. It's not as biblicist, has a stronger version of natural law, doesn't have the Van Tillian aversion to that sort of stuff. It's using the same name as 2K, right? Two kingdoms. So there's clearly some comment. We like Calvin. So those two guys, are we on the same team? No, we're actually not, because you're doing funny stuff with Calvin that we disagree with. Where obviously the Baptists are very different. They hear in it theocracy, theonomy, tyranny, we're going to get drowned. And so they're averse. And so it just kind of scrambles the Kuyperians.
That is so helpful, Dr. Rigney, because that's the scramble that I've been working through for the last like 6 months as I've been reading books and and I'm just like, why are these lines so fuzzy? Right. That is such a helpful way to sum that up.
Yeah. So that's what I think's happened. So, and then the Kuyperians, I think there's a difference there, because it's it's taking a particular application of Reformed principles. It elevated it into new principles, additional principles, modified it. And that's why the Kuyperians and the Theonomists get along really well, is because they're both modifications of a tradition that are doing like everything. And so they want to get rid of all the dualisms that they associate with, like Dr. Boot was doing, right? Like no dualisms. And I want to go, like, I don't have an aversion to dualisms. I think that's a Van Tillian thing. Van Til was real big on, if I recall, like, Aquinas is this sort of synthesis of paganism and Christianity, and we didn't fully excise the demon of Aristotle and Thomas in the Reformation, but now we did, right? Kuyper and the Dutch and Van Til did finally fully reform and get rid of that Aristotelian synthesis. And I think the Aristotelian synthesis was fine. I think Aristotle was onto stuff. I think the Reform thought that he had access, this was good wisdom stuff that they needed to modify. They couldn't just take it wholesale. It needed to be made obedient, but that there was real true observations in Aristotle and Seneca and Cicero that Calvin would look to and say, yeah, even the pagans get this, right? And they would just bring it over. And so I think that that's right. So I think that helps. And so, I mean, that's my commendation. Hopefully maybe that helps.
That is super helpful.
Clarify where some of the divisions are. Just run through those real quick again. General, special revelation, real big question. You got to decide how do those relate? They're both real. How do they relate? Authorization and competence. Do you need a Bible verse to authorize everything that the church or the state or the family does? Or there's a general authorization by nature, and then there's particular clarifications in Scripture which we draw on but aren't hard and fast in the same kind of way. Relevance of the Old Testament. Do we look to Moses for anything? What do we look to him for? What do we not look to him for? That's kind of with the Baptists. And then the substitution of family and state. Can we do that as a way of illuminating our principles? And then finally, principles versus prudence. Don't make your applications into new political principles. Instead, keep your application, and you can defend them. You can say, this is a really, I find myself doing this a lot. I think this is a really good way to do it. I think that's a really stupid way to do it, but it's technically not a sinful way to do it.
Okay.
Right. It's not I wouldn't say it's unbiblical.
Can you think something might be stupid enough to become sinful?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So if you double down on stupid, right? Yeah. If it's stupid and it becomes manifestly stupid, COVID would be a really good example of like, that got a little confused in the conversation. So I don't think that the quarantining of healthy people was lawful. I don't think that. I think that's
that came out.
So, but can the state quarantine the sick in the state in a real plague? Yes. Can it say, hey, we do want to shut everything down temporarily while we figure out what's going on? Yes. But so I think there's a lawful power there on Two Kingdoms grounds. Did they grossly abuse it in the case of it wasn't a plague like they said it was? And did they abuse it for a long time? Was it the right mechanism? So I think this is another thing. What Dr. Boot said of, hey, if the state came to the church and said, hey, could you guys help us out here? Right? Like, we're going to put this forward as a request, kind of respecting your independence as an alternative institution. But we think that with these guidelines, would you help us out? I think that would have been a far more effective. And I think they would have got a lot more compliance. Like we talked about this whenever it was in Minnesota, and we had some pretty heavy-handed. I think if the state had just said, hey, here's the guidelines, we'd like everybody to obey them. I think that you have some people who are going to go, nah, not gonna, different risk assessment. And if they can budget for that and be like, fine, great. But I think 90% of people for at least a season would have just gone along cheerfully.
I think
But
that's true because I mean, I know for me, just the sheer like tyrannical force of
Yes.
no, you may not,
Yes.
paired with you're non-essential while the weed
Correct.
shops are essential. All of that came together to just declare out loud a clear agenda. You know what
Correct.
I mean? Yeah.
And so that would be and if you say so I'm saying they have this kind of, in principle, they have a power to do this for the good ordering of society, the protection of a polity. They could quarantine. Okay. So I'm saying they do have that authority. But then they misuse it. Well, that's like a dad who, dad, you technically, if the kid spills the milk after you told him not to, he spilled it once and then he spilled it again. Could you spank him? Yes. Is that good? Is that wise use of your lawful power? No. If you keep doing that, are you going to embitter your kids, exasperate them, and cause greater rebellion? Yes. So it's that. So it's all like wise, judicious use of the tools God has given. And so I think this is one of my principles is, if I can accomplish, what am I after? What's the goal? If I can accomplish that using this means, then I'm going to use this means. If this one doesn't work, I'll use a different one. And this is where I think this is probably another difference. I think I hesitate a little bit, but I'm going to go for it. I think that some of the biblicism of theonomists evidence is a kind, like I understand the fear. If you make it all wisdom and prudence, then people are going to drive a bus of unbelief and disobedience through that, right? And it sort of feels safer to say this is the biblical way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a kind of aversion to wisdom there that's immature. Like we need to grow up into maturity, and as a civilization, we may not be able to do that right now, because we're a fundamentally rebellious and disobedient and foolish people. And so it may be that you need a heavy-handed, more direct, like, this is no now. I think that's actually kind of what happens with civilizations is mature civilizations that have a lot of self-control can have a limited government. Civilizations that don't have that cannot have limited government. You just can't. It's an impossibility. This is the classic John Adams quote, right? Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's unsuited for any other. There's a fitness between the regime and the people. Well, what happens if the people is not that people? You're going to get a different regime. It's not a question of whether you'll get a different. It's just which one. Which regime is another good example of a prudence call. So this is maybe final illustration of this kind of stuff, but democracy versus aristocracy versus monarchy, and what's the best regime? Is it one of those three, or is it a mixture of all three? Like ours is kind of a mixture. We have a temporary monarch, a 4-year monarch, right? And then you've got there's an aristocracy. There's kind of like the Senate and the that kind of thing. And then there's a democratic element. So we mix them. It's like, is there a biblical one? And I was like, well, Israel was a kind of constitutional monarchy. So God commends that one in that context. Is it the only one? Is that the only kind of government that we should aim for? And it's like, I don't think so. I think that I could imagine a small city state that decided to do be much more heavily democratic. The men in the city, the elders in the land gather together and they pass lots of laws as an assembly. I was like, that works. A large polity is probably not going to be able to function that way. Okay. So what is this? This is wisdom adapting the regime and its structures to a particular people by taking into account the histories and customs of that people in order, and in doing so. That's wisdom. And so I have the need for statesmanship, the need for wise statesmanship is required on a magisterial two kingdoms view, because you're putting so much in that prudence bucket. Whereas I think a theonomic view will sometimes be like, well, you don't actually have to have as wise of a statesman, because more things are specifically prescribed. These are just the biblical rules. And so much less is left up to wisdom calls. It's much more stay in your lane, stay in your lane, stay in your lane. And in that sense, feels to me, again, I don't want to push this too hard, but as a kind of immaturity. It's a biblicist immaturity, as opposed to eat the book, know the principles, but then like sometimes a prostitute's going to show up with a dead baby and you're going to be like, there is no verse for this. Like
Hey, there is though, right?
Huh? There's no verse. This would be my example of like, what did Solomon grow in? It was natural law. What did he need to know? The nature of mothers.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like his solution to the dead baby with the prostitute's problem is, I need to know something about mothers. What do I know about mothers? What do I know about their nature? What do I know about how God made them? If I say I'm going to kill the baby, the real mother is going to show herself. And the mother with the dead baby, in her grief and despair, won't. She'll be like, I just want everybody to die. And that's what happens. And he exposes this is the real mother, that's not, by his knowledge of the way the world works. And so when God gave him wisdom above all the wisdom of men, what did he give him wisdom in? The way the world works. This is wisdom, prudence, I think wisdom in sort of natural law.
Man, talking to you, just, it's great. And it also just, man, it just shifts my paradigms a little bit.
Okay, good.
It is good. No, because I'd said earlier that I've been calling myself a tentative theonomist because I knew that I had been convinced kind of at a surface level by essentially I'm coming out of some of that Van Drunen or Baptistic kind of thinking and seeing a more robust vision of how to the relationship between the church and the state, the roles and responsibility of, well, basically the trickle down. I feel like the trickle down of the Baptistic or the Van Drunen types is essentially just like they're thinking about some kind of political theology and philosophy. The trickle down is just, we don't care, we don't think about it. We don't even, like, it's not even on our radar. God doesn't want us to have anything to do with that. Right. I just, and that's so much of the gospel-centered world that I kind of came out of, was just like no political philosophy whatsoever. Right. Yep. And so now I'm getting handed something that begins to make sense. And now in talking with you and Stephen Wolf and others, I'm seeing, I like I said, I was tentative because I knew I hadn't done the due diligence of the dialogue between other traditions and things like that. And so with that, one last thing that I would like, if you could just draw some dots or break the dots, the connection for me. Yeah. There's a concern that I have in that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but so I've seen some, I'm sure, and I know you have too. And Doug did a blog and Mablog, a couple of them about it, but I've seen, so some of the online Theo bros going pretty hard, in the direction of like the blood and soil kind of, I hadn't even really experienced in real life, and if you can call X real life, but white nationalism. Actually, I hadn't never met anybody really, and then all of a sudden, I'm meeting a lot of guys who are kind of unapologetically starting to wave, if not the white nationalist flag, unapologetically saying, I'm going to wave the kinist flag and some of these other things, and real just ugly behavior. And I first encountered it from a guy named Corey Mahler. I don't know if you've seen his stuff with the Stone Choir. Yeah. And this is when I first got on Twitter like a year ago, and I was like, whoa, that's crazy. But then I did a search. He came up again and with some of the recent stuff. Yeah. And I saw, a bunch of my followers on Twitter also follow this guy. Corey Mahler. And so I'm seeing like there's some lines that are being drawn and things like, for those of you who don't know this guy, he's kind of unapologetically like Hitler was a good Christian man and kind of guy. And so my concern is that that there's a connection with natural law, with saying, okay, we can deduce naturally that white people, we should look at our skin. We should stick together, and look at the statistics here. White people do way better on X, Y, and Z. And so I fear that of course we would both agree that would be an abuse of natural law. But I sense there's a connection there, and I just would like you to speak to it, just what you've noticed with that and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So I think that if you recover a notion that a nation should act for its own interests, which is part of what the Christian nationalism, Stephen Wolf commends that, right? A nation should act as a Christian nation on behalf of itself and its citizens for its own good, seek its own good, earthly and heavenly. Then there's certain people who are going to come along and go, okay, so, and as they try to find, well, what's a nation, right? What is a nation? And likeness and affinity is at least one component of that. Okay, but then you have to go affinity in what sense? Okay, so there's a kind of biological affinity, an actual kinship. We descended from common ancestors, but a biblical notion of nation, and I think even like a natural law notion of nation, acknowledges that nationhood is bigger than simple. It's not just biology. Biology is one component, and I don't even know if it's the most essential one to nationhood. It is, biology is essential for familial, but not for necessarily nationhood. For nation, I think you do have to look for something like covenant as a component to it, or short of that, if you don't have a nation that's covenanted, you're going to have things like shared history, shared language, shared customs and culture, shared worldview, shared belief systems. All of those things, I think everybody would acknowledge. This goes into, and then in some cases, like a common law, a common name, and a common law. Like we are this people, and we're under a common law. And so I think in the attempt to kind of define in a multi-ethnic, multicultural society on the far side of a bunch of really gnarly race stuff, both historically in this country, a caste system in which certain, with the introduction of kind of that racial category, there's just going to be a big mess. And I think certain folks are trying to sort through that. And some of them are taking it like they would anything into a really nasty, gnarly place and view skin tone as a sort of better boundary marker than something like shared history, culture, and custom. So I look at this and go, an African American who's an American and a Christian, right, is more my people than someone who shares my skin color, right, but comes from Germany, right?
Yeah.
That's not my people. He's not my people. This guy is more my people because of 200 years of shared American history.
Yeah.
Okay. That's why we're now, and I think that there is ways. I think that, Stephen Wolf actually has done a pretty decent job in his recent talk at the New Christendom, where we were a year or so, or last summer, on Anglo-Protestantism as a potential candidate for what is an American ethnic identity, which establish it as there's a real history there rooted in England that came over when the colonies were founded, but that was also capable of kind of absorbing and assimilating other ethnicities, European ethnicities and non-European ethnicities at times into it, such that Americans are Anglo-Protestants, and Clarence Thomas is an Anglo-Protestant, and Chocolate Knox is an Anglo-Protestant, and there can be Latino guys whose family of origin, in the background was from Mexico or someplace else, but who have all kind of become Anglo-Protestant over a process of ethnogenesis. So I think that that's a really fruitful way. That's the way I have tended to think about it, because it allows for a real a sense of definition. Like I can describe what American is, but it's not strict in the sense of I'm not counting chromosomes and I'm not looking at melanin content as sort of like the be all end all of that. In fact, that's down the list in terms of what actually constitutes that identity. But I think other guys are basically saying, well, in some ways it's the same kind of it's an immaturity, right? It's like, well, this is the easy way to see how white is he, and taking pride in whiteness as a kind of representative for a culture identity, I just think is a kind of it's the sinful. It's human pride in that particular form. There's other forms of it, ideological and whatnot, but like it's just a sinful form of that, and I don't think it's essential to it. And I think a more robust. This is where I do appreciate having hung out with a lot of I'm here with a bunch of general equity theonomists. Toby and Jared, as we've talked about these things, really do rightly, I think, accent that notion of covenant as a more fundamental binding agent. In a lot of ways. And I think that's something that the theonomists typically emphasize is like covenants matter. And therefore that can forge a people. A covenant can forge a people. It did in Israel. The mixed multitude came out and they were forged by covenant. And so that's something that that's a biblical idea that we should bring into the conversation of how do you define what your nation is, who your people are.
That's good. Well, that's helpful. I'm going to let you go because you've given me an extra hour and a half, I think. I would love to do this again, though. Yeah. I really just every conversation I've had with you has been very enlightening.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been helpful.
Let's see. I feel like I had one other question, and this is not, this is just a practical question. If I got, I think this particular conversation around two kingdoms, classical two kingdoms. And theonomy and sphere sovereignty is a particularly important discussion to be had right now, as Dr. Boot was mentioning. I would love to get to see if perhaps someone like Lusk would come on, and I would love to do, if you'd be interested in doing a formal debate, that would be something awesome.
You talk about Rich?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how much Rich and I would disagree, though.
Okay, well, who do you think would be the best person to get if we did like a formalized debate? Because I loved the discussion that we were having, but the whole time I was thinking, I wish that this was a little more formalized so that we could get like kind of put our finger on more of the hot spots.
Yeah, so a mechanism for that. I mean, you could pick whoever you want, but it might be worthwhile to actually, you had your kind of list of questions at the end.
Yeah.
And it might be worth putting together kind of like 5 questions.
Yep.
And then come in and everybody, whoever it is, I'll give you, the yes or no answer plus some of the architecture underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
They can give their yes or no answer with their architecture, and then that would kind of start to clarify, oh, you think this and I don't think that.
If you want to even help me come up with some of that, I think this is I really think this is so important, because there's now a group, a surging up of young men who really want to have a Christian political vision.
Right.
We don't have many places to look, it seems.
Right.
And so I'll email you about that. And then maybe we can, it might even be just like getting you and Toby or something like that. But I'll reach out about it. Well, I've taken up enough of your time. I thank you so much, Dr. Rigney. I'm going to actually, if you'll just give us one more time and pray for everyone who just listened to this.
For sure.
And then we'll just finish up like that.
Okay. Father, we're grateful for this conversation. Great. Hope it was illuminating and clarifying. We pray that you would, if there's errors in it, you'd reveal them and help us to reject them. But as we help us to grow up into maturity in knowledge of you and the way that you want us to live, we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, that does it for us on this backstage episode of the Reformation Red Pill podcast. My hope and prayer, as always, is that this will be a resource for you so that you would be better equipped to build, defend, and expand the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ.